Hello, welcome to this game review. We'll skip to a critical moment where black could have won some material by using a pin tactic, in which he missed, but later he outplayed his opponent, got a good endgame, and eventually won. So in this game, it started as a Caro-Kann, the classical variation. Black developed the bishop, and here it's important to understand kind of the context of this position. So black's plan is just to develop with e6 and put his bishop on d6 and the knight is in the center. And if he does this, he will not really have any problems. White, on the other hand, has a knight on g3, which isn't a good piece, and white has to justify this. White does have some lead in development, which is why people usually play something like h4, try to attack, get something with his knight on g3. In this game, white just developed naturally, and he got a worse position because of the fact that he was just developing instead of looking for dynamics. So h3 also kind of slow. Black played c5 after developing all of his pieces, so he is doing everything correctly, and now black can fight for an advantage. He can develop his queen and put his rooks on c8 and d8. So rook e1, black played queen b6. Already here, black could have just taken on d4. The reason being, if white takes with the knight, this is a fork, so this is impossible. If the queen takes, then this queen might come under fire, for example, after knight d5, bishop f6, or bishop c5. Otherwise, if the pawn takes, then we have a nice situation with the isolated queen's pawn. And this is quite a bad IQP for white because his moves were not very active, his pieces are badly placed, so black will be doing quite well. But okay, queen b6 is fine. This attacks the pawn in b2, which white somehow ignores, knight e5, and black decides not to take this pawn. But in general, with such pawns, if we cannot see anything concrete, then we should take it. Of course, we should check whether or not we're not breaking opening principles. For example, if black were still uncastled, if his pieces were way back here, then the priorities would be to get developed. Well, black hasn't done anything wrong. He developed all of his pieces, he played in the center, so there's no reason not to take the pawn. We should be brave in chess. White doesn't have any way to exploit our queen. c3 is also hanging. For example, if white takes this, queen d3 or something, this almost threatens to trap the queen, but even then we have some squares and we can just continue with the initiative. And black is a pawn up basically for nothing. But rook fd8 instead, knight g6. White could have played a bit better with knight c4. In these variations, the queen on b6 will be quite badly placed. But now we're coming up to the important moment, rook ac8. And now white plays this move d5, which in principle is kind of correct. White has the bishop pair, he has the unopposed light squared bishop, so it makes sense to open up the light squares, but this simply doesn't work at all. And the one clue that it doesn't work is that the rook is looking at the queen. If white, for example, had played queen c2 and rook a d1 before doing this, then this would work. But now, after d5, black had a chance to use the pin on the queen. Importantly, black can't just win the pawn outright because the rook on e7 and the bishop on e7 is hanging. But there was this tactic: knight takes d5, bishop takes d5 and knight f6, and this should be quite findable. This is a sequence of two forcing moves. Now the bishop cannot move because the queen is hanging, so white will lose his bishop. After c4 we cannot take the bishop yet because this bishop is still hanging, but again we can just move the bishop or defend the bishop, and this bishop on d5 is not going anywhere, and the black will be left a pawn ahead at the end of these variations. So this should be findable, and the clue should be the queen on d8 and the rook on and the queen on d1 and the rook on d8. There was a reason we put a rook here, right? So we could use it like this. Knight f8 is a bit slow, and at this point black did have 16 minutes, so perhaps he just did not feel the critical moment. Knight f8. Now after c4, still white is not really doing too well. because of this pin. Bishop d6 is a nice move, getting rid of the bishop pair. And the position is about equal, but the pawn on d5 will be quite weak. So queen b3 takes, and white takes on b6. And black could have again won a pawn, but he was concerned about the passed pawn and the threat on b7. But again, if we cannot see anything concrete, we shouldn't be scared. For example, here black has 3 against 1. He has won a pawn. His knights are defending from this passed pawn. The rook can come to help as well. So unless white has something serious for this pawn that he has lost, there is no reason not to take. Right. So similarly to before. Rook AB. The pawn on d5 has been lost, but the pawn on b7 on the other hand is also quite weak, and black is in some sort of pin, which should compensate. White could now improve his pieces with knight e4 and knight c3, and here for example, after a variation like this, black is still a pawn up, but his pawn majority is hard to mobilize, so white has enough compensation. After rook e5, now black gets some counterplay as well, and after knight e4 and rook d4, white still hasn't gotten his pawn back, and if he still doesn't get the pawn back soon, then black's pawn up will become quite important. So knight c3, knight e6, developing, knight b5, but this allows rook d2. White should have just taken this pawn while he had the chance. After knight b5, again black did not go for the most active continuation, like with queen takes b2 and like with rook takes b6. Somehow black is very hesitant to play actively, and here rook d2 is quite an obvious move, but black did not want to lose this pawn, I guess. But after rook b2, it's clear that the pawn on b2 was more important than the one on b7, and more importantly, the rook keeps black keeps his rook active. That's what I'm trying to say. In endgames, the most important thing is to have active pieces. In that case, this goes against the principle, which is why this is not a very good move. Okay, a3. Still black is a pawn ahead. He is doing quite fine. At some point, he exchanges finally the pawns on b2 for the one on b7. And now black's plan should be quite simple to bring the king, maybe perhaps exchange some minor pieces, and try to create a passed pawn. So king f8 is a nice move, king f1, king e7, the king is here, and here black had the chance to basically win the game. With knight to d4, this forces the exchange, and it also forces the creation of a passed pawn. Black's next moves could be king d6 to c5, maybe even c4 and c3 if allowed. And black's plan is quite simple to promote his passed pawn. f6, g5 can be played so that he doesn't lose these pawns, and the rest should be a matter of technique. Knight c4, now after bishop d5, black wins quite easily. White could still fight on with king d3. The position is not that clear since the king is quite active, but after this the game ended quite simply. Black created the fork, and from here it's quite simple with a knight up. So in this game black had some chances to play actively with this b2 pawn all the time, and also with this tactic on d5. This should be findable at many levels. This isn't a very deep calculation. Knight d5 and knight f6, and the bishop will drop down for nothing, and the black will be a pawn ahead.